Welcome to an Odyssey in Mixology. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into Buffalo Trace's mash bill number 1, and ultimately how it changes over 15 years of barrel aging. Enjoy! What makes a great bourbon? Well, it's completely subjective, but each of these 4 bottles will be someone's answer to that question. For me, I'm less concerned with which one is best, even though it's obviously the George T. Stagg. From my standpoint, there's just more value in having them next to each other. Despite having different names, ages, and proofs, they use the same low-rye distillate. Trying them as a group shows how that flavor changes over various years of barrel aging. The White Dog is an unaged to distillate bottled at 125 proof. It's the base of the other bourbons and likely the most profitable because it goes directly from still to bottle whilst maintaining a price per volume higher than Buffalo Trace. Buffalo Trace is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey bottled at 90 proof. Each bottle contains a blend of bourbons aged anywhere from 4 to 8 years in new charred oak barrels. Because of the Kentucky straight bourbon designation, it's free of additives, coloring, or extra flavoring. Eagle Rare is also a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey bottled at 90 proof. It's mostly similar to the Buffalo Trace, however the youngest whiskey found in each Eagle Rare blend spends at least 10 years in the barrel. This creates a more mature and nuanced bourbon. The king of these bourbons is George T. Stagg. It's a limited annual release that's contents are aged to 15 years and bottled at barrel strengths between 116 and 145 proof. These proofs vary by year, and the higher they are, generally the more coveted the bottle is. Even though this bottle is one of the lower proof releases, it still retains the characteristics that are a staple of this hard-to-come-by bourbon. Before trying each of these, let's start at the beginning, because regardless of your feelings on these bottles, Buffalo Trace has a rich and vibrant history. As of 2024, there are over 2,000 distillers in the United States either distilling their own bourbon or sourcing it from others. Unfortunately, the majority of these distillers will never have a nationwide presence because 98% of all whiskey comes from 8 large companies that own the big names like Jack Daniel's, Jim Beam, and Four Roses. Of these 8 companies, one is called Sazerac, and under them is a medium-sized distillery with an infamous level of desirability, quality, and at times controversy. That distillery is none other than Buffalo Trace. Buffalo Trace Distillery is named after sections of the Vincennes migration path that was created by countless buffalo walking between Kentucky and Illinois. In the mid to late 1700s, it became a highway of sorts for settlers as they moved west. In 1775, a pair of brothers named Hancock and Willis Lee claimed land off the Vincennes Buffalo Trace near Kentucky's Frankfort settlement. Their settlement, Leestown North, became a travel and trading hub due to its fertile farmland and proximity to the Kentucky River. In the early 1800s, Harrison Blanton began distilling whiskey in the settlement, but it wouldn't be until 1858 when a modern production distillery was created. The distillery was bought by Colonel Edmund H. Taylor in 1870 and named OFC. It's an anagram for Old Fire Copper, which references the original whiskey stills that were used. It was then bought by George T. Stagg in 1878. George T. Stagg brought innovation to the distillery, and in 1886, an environmental control system was created using steam pipes to keep the barrel-aging warehouse warmer during winter. It was the first system of its kind, and whilst they had setbacks in the forms of fires and floods, the distillery grew steadily over the years. In 1904, the distillery was renamed the George T. Stagg Distillery. During Prohibition, the distillery was granted an allowance to make medicinal whiskey. As one of the 6 distilleries in the U.S. to be granted this allowance, production actually increased during the 1920s. After Prohibition, things were relatively quiet. Descendants of the original Blanton and Lee rose to the distillery's ranks, production continued to increase, and new products like the first single-barrel bourbon, Blanton's, was produced. The latter occurred after a change of ownership in 1982 to a New York investment company. The distillery was finally acquired by the Sazerac Company in 1992 and rebranded to its current name. Since then, over $1 billion have poured into Buffalo Trace, resulting in a substantial increase in whiskey production, as well as new product lines like the budget bourbon of the distillery's new namesake. That production hasn't really caught up to demand, though. Part of what makes Buffalo Trace controversial is that whilst the MSRP prices for their whiskey are reasonable, even good, it's far more common to see their bottles priced substantially higher. This chart shows which brands fall under the Buffalo Trace umbrella, as well as some extra info on each. The ones I have in this video are highlighted in green. The secondary markup column is dependent on location, so this is geared a bit more towards where I am in South Florida. As far as mash bills go, there are 4 main ones for the general bottle releases. These are the low rye bourbon number 1, high rye bourbon number 2, wheated, and the standard rye. A mash bill is the breakdown of the different grains in a whiskey's raw distillate. For bourbons, it's usually a combination of corn, barley, rye, and sometimes wheat. The exact ratio of these grains can be publicized or it can be proprietary and a closely guarded secret. Now, Buffalo Trace's mash bills are unfortunately a secret, but we can make some smart assumptions. Mash bill number 1 is a low rye mash bill, so it should be less than 10% rye. To be a straight bourbon, it must contain at least 51% corn, and it's generally assumed that mash bill number 1 has around 75%. This leaves the remaining 15% to be malted barley due to wheat being a little less common and having its own mash bill on the list. So now that we know more about the distillery and the distillate in these bottles, it's time to pour the glasses because what really matters here is taste. Color-wise, the unaged White Dog is clear, and the 5-year Buffalo Trace has some color, maybe akin to a deep copper. The 10-year Eagle Rare is ever so slightly darker, but it really is barely noticeable. Finally, the 15-year George T. Stagg leans more towards a mahogany. The darker brown and red hues jump out as the most drastic color difference between the 4 glasses. Now, I am blasting a lot of light into these, so a casual pour might be a bit darker across the board. Secondly, prior to 2019, the bottle side of the back label on George T. Stagg was an off-white color. In later years, the bottle side of the label has switched to black, mimicking what's seen on Eagle Rare. They say this was to stop counterfeiting, but it also has a happy result of darkening the bourbon in the bottle. It's part of why the post-2019 releases from both look so much darker in photos and on the shelf. The real tell is when the bottles are turned to their side and you can look through the glass without the label affecting the darkness. My bourbon palate isn't as developed as my mezcal or scotch palate, so I try to keep my thoughts to a few easy to understand and fairly objective describers. It's going to be violent. So on the nose, the White Dog definitely smells of sharp corn. There's kind of a funkiness there as well. It kind of splits the difference between, let's say, a coppery metallic and more of a composting smell. It's probably pretty bad for most people's palates, especially those of you who are coming from, the aged whiskey that this ultimately ends up being. That being said, I kind of like it. As someone who seeks out weirder non-whiskey bottles, it's not too much of an affront to my senses. Funny enough, this actually reminds me of a Haitian Clarin. There's obviously more corn in the White Dog, but the off notes are somewhat similar, and to some people quite desirable. It's definitely more vegetal, but this is still interesting, and I see the similarity. For the taste of the White Dog, it's very similar to the smell. There's kind of an oily, pervading corn note that's strong, sharp, and not at all smooth. It tastes almost plasticky instead of the metallic notes I got in the aroma, but there's still that kind of lick of a battery taste about it. It's fairly sweet, but it's really overshadowed by the in-your-face sharpness and the off notes. It's definitely more of a deviation from the Clarin La Roche I have, but it's similar to other Clarins that I've tried. Basically, if you buy this with the expectation that you're going to taste all of the wonderful flavors from a bourbon just without the oakiness, you're going to be very disappointed. This might be more of a novelty experience for bourbon lovers, but in other spirit families near to bourbon, it's actually pretty common. I already went on a tangent with the Clarins, but as another fun tangent, if I'm talking brandy, then this is a bottle of an Armagnac Blanche. It's from the Armagnac region of France, and it shares some of the characteristics with the White Dog. Both of these are raw distillates of a spirit that is normally barrel-aged. This one is meant to be drank straight as a pure form of Armagnac. The White Dog isn't rested before bottling, and the overall ingredients makes this less enjoyable. That being said, if you do enjoy the White Dog, you should check out Clarins and you should check out unaged Armagnacs. Anyways, the point of this video is as a comparison between bourbons, and from that standpoint, what I'm looking for in the other bottles is how does the sharpness from the White Dog smooth out, and how does the barrel impact round out the oily corn and off notes into the final beautiful oak and cherry caramel sweetness that I know the 15-year-old George T. Stagg has. So the Buffalo Trace already starts that journey. On both the nose and the taste, oak and caramel is coming through in addition to the corn, but it's still pretty light flavor-wise. This is a young whiskey, and there just hasn't been enough time for everything to mellow out yet. I'd say the bitter caramel is is slightly dominant over the corn flavor, but there's complexity driven by all three flavors. This has been diluted, so the sweetness is lower than the White Dog as well. The tail end of the raw distillate's offness kind of is turning into oak tannins, with an oak tannin flavor being somewhat bitter, astringent, or mouth-drying in accompaniment with the wood itself. These flavors are created by the tannins diffusing from the oak wood to the distillate itself. This occurs very quickly at first and then slows down over time. These tannins create a bitter flavor, but they also break down other molecules found in the wood. Some of these molecules, namely lignans, release desirable flavors like vanilla and spice once the tannins have done their work to them. Young whiskeys have high levels of tannins and low levels of broken down lignans. This is usually what I consider a staple flavor in young whiskeys. It's not really a negative, but it's also not a common quality in older, more refined bourbons. Older bourbon might have only slightly more tannins, but a lot more broken down lignans, which contributes to a more complex flavor. Overall, this is a great first step. The corn is layering with the oak and caramel, and it's well on its way to smoothing out and really letting that underlying sweetness blossom into the more vanilla and chocolatey flavors that I associate with Eagle Rare. The Eagle Rare is aged for 10 years, and to me, this is the optimum age for a bourbon, give or take a couple of years. It can become further refined with more age, but then the price starts to skyrocket. So on the nose, the Eagle Rare has a very oaky and caramel forward aroma. There's notes of vanilla and ever so subtle hints of bitter cherry. Overall, it's not a huge deviation from the Buffalo Trace, but you can tell that there's a little bit more subtlety here, there's a little bit more complexity, and it's a little bit more mellow. And all of that is coming from the extra duration in the barrel. Okay. So taste-wise, there's more of a difference than the smells. The main upgrade here is the annihilation of those off notes from the raw distillate and a heavy reduction on the young whiskey notes from the Buffalo Trace. The flavors, when compared to Buffalo Trace, have all just kind of filled out a bit more. There's slightly more complexity, the flavors are all a bit stronger. It's really smooth and kind of reminiscent of bitter dark chocolate instead of the more oaky caramel flavors of the Buffalo Trace. I'd say compared to the aroma, I get less of a fruit note in the taste, but there is a little bit more vanilla to make up for it. The sweetness from the raw distillate is still present, and the corn is blended really well with the oak. There are no plasticky or metallic flavors left over from the raw distillate. There really weren't any with the Buffalo Trace either, but this tastes like it has some age to it, and it's mellowed out quite a bit. I think calling this the quintessential quality bourbon might get me in trouble, but I'm going to stand by it. If someone just asks for a bourbon, this is the generic flavor profile that they're looking for. It's not surprising, it checks all the boxes, and whilst there are better deals out there, near MSRP, this is an easy buy for me every time. If it's not abundant by you at a reasonable price, then look for bottles in the 8 to 12 year mark from big brands like Knob Creek. It's not going to be exactly the same, and that could be a positive or a negative from each person's point of view, but it'll check off the boxes of a quality bourbon that doesn't break the bank. That of course brings me to the George T. Stagg. Now, I have no hope of finding this bottle in MSRP, so I borrowed this one from a whiskey collector friend of mine. That's why it's got this fun little tape on the side that tells me where I can drink to before I have to start opening my wallet. Now, this is the only George T. Stagg bottle that he has because he prefers the taste of the Weller antique releases. He used this to introduce people to other bottles in his collection with higher proofs. It's not his favorite, and for that reason, the fill line hasn't dropped as fast as the others. With all of these antique releases becoming more and more unattainable, it was the easiest one for him to part with, but regardless, thank you very much for letting me borrow it. So the 15-year-old barrel strength George T. Stagg smells and tastes like it's playing a different game. For starters, the 23% increase in proof from Eagle Rare's 90 to this one's 117 amplifies and concentrates every flavor and smell by what I can only imagine is the same amount. A barrel or cask strength whiskey can sometimes be sharp and just roll over your tongue, but some of them seem to ignite every single one of my taste buds individually. This is one of those, and immediately it's more of an experience than the others. I hate to say it tingles, but it kind of does. It's spicy and vibrant, and frankly, a bit of a shock to your system. Even though it's 117 and not, some of the hazmat 140 pluses, It's still a bit of a jolt, especially when I've been sipping on the Eagle Rare and the Buffalo Trace. That being said, the follow-up sips are usually where things calm down, so I'm just going to keep drinking it. Flavor-wise, the closest comparison is the Eagle Rare. In the Eagle Rare, the age was starting to come through. In this one, the additional age brings in more smooth oak. It's increased more than the difference between the Buffalo Trace and the Eagle Rare. But part of that is just due to the lack of dilution here. Regardless, the corn is even more overshadowed by the barrel impact, but it's undeniably still a low rye and high corn bourbon. The sweetness is more pronounced. Whereas the Buffalo Trace had kind of a sharp sweetness and the Eagle Rare had more of a bitter chocolate sweetness, this one is a bit more syrupy. The dark chocolate is still there, it's not as bitter, but the cherry, maybe even like strawberry fruit notes matured, and over the same span got stronger than the increase in the caramel flavor over the same time frame. It kind of rebalances the bourbon from heavily oak forward to more of a noticeably complex fruity oak. I mean, it's a really good bourbon, and frankly, how can it not be? Even though this is the lowest proof George T. Stagg annual release, it doesn't suffer a loss in intensity. Maybe it does a little bit compared to one of the hazmat releases that are over 140 proof, but while sipping this, under no circumstance do I feel like I'm missing out on part of the experience, or that it would necessarily be that much better if it was just a little bit stronger. I mean, the step between these two is monstrous. Anywhere near MSRP, even double MSRP, I mean, I would buy this in a heartbeat. Is it good enough to justify the secondary prices? No, I don't think anything is. This is going for anywhere from $600 to $2,000, depending on what year and where you get it from. And frankly, for that amount of money, there's no conceivable benefit. But ignoring cost, it is undeniably a wonderful cask strength bourbon. So what have I learned? Well, the primary flavors of the raw distillate is a generic sweetness and an off-metallic or even plasticky corn. This is the starting point, and once barreling is finished, the impact starts immediately. This next part of the video is my best attempt at visually showing how the flavors change over time, so it might be a bit subjective. This is how I interpret the three main flavors in the White Dog. Corn and sweetness are prominent and level. There are some off notes, which is again normal for raw distillates, but they're a bit lower in comparison. Over the course of 15 years of barrel aging, the corn level remains relatively unchanged, but it does change due to the barrel impact. It also drops a bit due to the dilution of the Buffalo Trace and the Eagle Rare. Once aging starts, the off notes fall off extremely quickly. I get hints of it in the Buffalo Trace, but this is again common in younger whiskeys. It's not a negative because it works with the other flavors to create complexity. The sweetness is similar to the corn in that it's relatively consistent across the board. That being said, it does change from white sugar to caramel to chocolate to cherry between the four bottles. The oak and wood flavor isn't linear, but the jump in proof between the Eagle Rare and the George T. Stagg warps it into a mostly straight line. After the George T. Stagg, I think the increase in oak flavor would drop off substantially. The harsh tannic flavor starts as soon as the spirit contacts the charred barrel. It rises quickly over the first couple of years and then starts to mellow out as it ages further. This isn't saying that the Eagle Rare and the George T. Stagg lack tannic flavors, but they're more mellow and rounded out. The nice tannic flavors would be much more in line with the oak graph I showed previously. The fruit notes of cherry and strawberry aren't really present in the Buffalo Trace, but they do become more prominent as the distillate ages. Finally, the vanilla notes start earlier than the fruit notes and grow to a considerable level at the end of the George T. Stagg's barrel aging. The increase of vanilla seems to be a bit more linear than the increase in the fruit notes. Overall, these individual comparisons give the following chart that shows how the primary flavors of each bottle fall off and grow based on the aging duration. This is somewhat subjective, so whilst you might not agree on the levels that I have for each, I think the trend lines for each characteristic would be fairly consistent across the board. That's it for my video on comparing how one of the most infamous bourbon distillates changes over 15 years of barrel aging. In my next video, I'm going to show some footage I took at the Sunset Tequila and Mezcal Festival in Boca Raton last month. Not all of the festival's highlights were agave related, so I'm going to go through the bottles and local brands that I thought stood out amongst the rest. If you haven't subscribed, then please do so, but above all else, thank you so much for watching. Cheers!